Salem, Massachusetts. Now, a lot of this may not be in chronology that I'm giving you, because that becomes foolish for somebody to, unless they have a photographic memory, can remember exactly. But these are impressions, which are probably more important since they're the ones that remain, you see. And I remember in Salem that I met, we did a play called Created Equal. I was really hired originally to do a play called The Great Barrington at Salem, Massachusetts, to play the lead in that. And that I'll never forget, because I'd never heard a New England accent before, or really heard it. And we had this guy had a fight with me, duel with me, and then he killed me. And I was lying there, a corpse on the stage, and I never even listened to him during rehearsal. But just before we opened, the night before we opened, when we went through a complete run-through in costume, and he killed me. And I'm lying there, and I hear him saying, I fought and fought over him. I broke up. I was glad that I broke up then and not in front of an audience, because I fought and fought is the way I understood it. Fought and fought is the way they talked, park your car and all the rest of it. But it was, I met Frank Silvera, I met Ralph Coleman, I met some of the extraordinary black talent later on doing a play called Creative Equal. And that, for me, was my last experience on the project, you see. Because from there I became a radio announcer. But Created Equal was an extraordinary document, like a living newspaper. Again, the style that the Federal Theater could afford to do, because it had a lot of actors, and they thought in epic terms, and I don't even know who directed it. But I know that Frank Silvera, who became later on my best friend, a very distinguished actor who only recently died. Frank was a light-skinned Indian, West Indian, and I'll never forget him saying that he would not play a slave. He would refuse to play a slave. And they tried to explain that this is only recreating the early days, and he didn't have to play a slave because Created Equal was, essence, liberal and progressive. But he wouldn't do it, and I got to know that guy. And then I met all of the black talent in Boston at that time.
And this was where there was integration.
Yes, there was complete integration, and there was, I think, some of the exciting talent that was revealed that came out of the Federal Theater that would not have come out in such creative terms as the Boston experience. Because from there on, when they began to hand out pink slips in the project, I decided I might as well take advantage of the fact that I knew Frank. He let me room with him, so I would save some money, and then I quit the project before they fired me, because I didn't want to go back to New York. And I lived in Boston, got a job as a radio announcer eventually, and Frank kind of kept me alive until I got a job.
That's terrific.
And then I got out of it. But one of the theater groups that I was in, again, an extraordinary experience, and I'll tell you a wonderful story, all right?
Okay.
So might as well put it all down. Nobody will ever hear it, except you and me. But when they transferred, the kind of chaos that existed in the Federal Theater at times is when they would fire people, when they were about to open. And they were going to open Coriolanus. And I think it was Houseman, there was not John Houseman, another Houseman, Theater of Four Seasons, it was called, at Roslyn, Long Island. We did a whole program in Roslyn. And we did Captain Jinx of the Horse Marines, and we did a thing called Peace by Tulla, a very interesting anti-war play, and Coriolanus. Now, I was in Captain Jinx of the Horse Marines, and I was loaned out to that project because they were in trouble. Actors had been fired, and they were ready to go into New York at the Empire Theater, and they were going to have a debut of the Theater of Four Seasons on Broadway. Another kind of project that existed, a kind of stock, or what we call a repertory company. But this was in Roslyn, Long Island, a beautiful former summer theater, and it was an all-year-round operation. And I was called in there, and I was part of that program. Then at the last minute, they fired the guy who was the messenger in Coriolanus. He got a pink slip. Now, they said, have you ever done any Shakespeare? And I said, yes, well, because I'd never done any Shakespeare. And they gave me this thing to learn overnight, and we were going to open up in Coriolanus the next night.
The next night.
And I learned it all of these messages, and they were important messages. Coriolanus hath arrived, the people fawneth upon him. And it was all through these exits and entrances, and I had to wear a mini skirt in those days and sandals and the rest of the jazz, and they had hundreds of people in this production. As a matter of fact, one of the reviewers said, the actors would be in the men's lounge and the women's lounge downstairs, and then at a certain cue, when I came running down the aisle and saying, "Hail, Caius Marcius Coriolanus," then walked up these stairs and turned around and said, "Hail, all hail to Caius Marcius Coriolanus," then hundreds of actors would pour out of the toilets and the restrooms, and with these carrying women on these huge chair sedans, and all dressed in ancient Roman togas, and one of the reviewers said, "If you come late, you'll be swept into ancient Rome, so come early and get seated," because you would pour down the aisle. It was the most spectacular use of theater, you see, and it was very imaginative and very exciting. And they'd given me all of these speeches, and I memorized it, and I thought, and I dress rehearsal the next day. I had them all, the entrances and the exits and the speeches.
You had it all down.
I had it all down. Now, we opened up that night in front of critics. And I had to come on stage at one time and say to these two tribunes of the people, Junius Brutus and Sicinius, and come on and say, and it was very crucial, "Hail, noble senators, Caius Marcius Coriolanus hath arrived, the Senate falleth upon him, they desire you as tribunes of the people to come and hasten hither," or some. It was a very important change. And I was so panicky. And I came on, I said, "Hail, noble senators." And I couldn't think of what else to say. And I said, "That is all." And all I remember is that kind of Pittsburgh plate glass look on me over their eyes as they said, "Oh, me thinketh he meaneth to tell us," and all I could hear him muttering and trying to ad-lib some terrible Shakespeare. And he thinketh to hasten the Senate, and it was just terrible. And the corollary of this is that 20 years later, I played Junius Brutus with Will Geer in the Coriolanus of Robert Ryan at the Phoenix Theater in New York. And I had not looked at Coriolanus until that time, and here I was playing Brutus, one of the senators. And there was a little guy named Jamie Smith who had just come from Paris. He was an ex-GI, and he was going to play the messenger. And we sat all around the Phoenix Theater with Ryan and Will Geer and myself, and a lot of very, very well-known actors, John Emery and John Houseman was the director, and we were all sitting. T. Edward Hamilton was there, and all sitting around. And I'll let this little guy, Jamie Smith, and God knows where he is today, I know where he is, use his words. He said, we just sat down at the table. He says, and the big burly actor, that was me, right, grabbed me by the scruff of the neck. I grabbed his shirt. He said to me, "You little son of a bitch, you forget your lines and I'll beat the shit out of you." He said, I didn't know what he was talking about. And all I could think about was, what he does to me what I did to those two guys, I'll kill him. And it must have been in the back of my brain for 20 years before I was in. But that was an extraordinary experience.
No kidding.
But it was the kind of, like you were dumped in all of these things, and it was exciting.
Well, and then I have a question then about how, were you automatically assigned a new play as soon as you finished one, or?
Well, I think you tried very hard. That was the big problem, how they could cast, how could they use all the people.
Yeah.
Again, one thing I left out, and I don't remember how they reassigned us, or whether we asked for it, because those things weren't important to you. The thing was to keep moving, and I was young, and as I told you, there weren't that many young people. A lot of actors had had experience. They had a lot of people who've been poor or on home relief, or the small percentage that were hired for special parts were more distinguished actors who were kind of co-opted into the project when they were not actors of that particular caliber. Also, I think that if we were requested, I remember, requested by a group, sometimes it was like a request would come in from a regional theater like Salem, Massachusetts, or the Four Seasons. They needed another actor to replace an actor who was gone. And if you weren't working in the Children's Theater, if you were available in a pool and you could Now I remember, there must have been a pool of some kind that we could be sent to, and where we would go out of.
Yeah.
See, I have not thought of any of this for many, many years, and you probably, in your research, have come across more.
That one thing that just came up is in my mind with the first seasons at Roslyn, when you were loaned out to that. Charles Hopkins had something to do with that. What do you remember about him? I'm just
well, he was a very famous producer, and he was kind of a stout man and very ambitious, and obviously had done a lot of work before. I was very flattered that.
Well, that's what he chose you to.
Yes.
To do.
Well, I think that really a lot of times they just asked for a young man, or somebody who was a juvenile, because they needed a reporter and Captain Jinks of the Horse Marines, and they needed somebody, a young kind of leading man in a piece by Tuller, and they had, and Coriolanus always had a lot of people. I think that how you got picked never occurred to me, whether, I didn't care, I think.
No, you were busy most of the time.
I was working all the time, and I was glad that I had a chance to go in the theater 4 seasons, and I was glad to have a chance to go to Maine and to Boston. That was all exciting to me. And the point is that you were learning your craft all that time under different kind of working conditions. And in the process, you met many extraordinary people, talented people. And those are the ones that I can still, even today, I know there were some like that I met, Kurt Conway, Harry Lesson. Some remained in the business, some came out here, and some of them never succeeded, just disappeared. But it was, the ferment was so great. Now, one of the things, for example, the first argument I remember in the Children's Theater was a discussion of the use of the word nigger in Around the World in 80 Days. And there was a progressive man named Abel Plen, whose name I had not thought about for 40 years. Was a small redheaded man who was a project producer, I think. And to get a play that would use all the people was a very, very difficult thing, you see. Everybody wanted to work, you see. And in Around the World in 80 Days, I think there was a character named Passepartout. And he was dark-skinned, and somebody called him a nigger. And that was in the script.
In the script.
And there was a protest by, at that time, the communist group or left-wing group, but I didn't know who they were. But I knew that they were principal people, and they thought it was an insult. They even used that term, that there's a federal theater and there was no sense. Why should we use the term nigger? It doesn't have to be used. And then the argument was, well, that's the way the writer wrote it. If the writer put it in, then this was the old type, the old-timers. And it was a terrible fight. It was splitting the group. Because there were the younger people and more liberal people who felt, why should we have a word that would be an insult to people who belong to this country? And I had never known there were people who were that interested myself, so I was one of the neutral, and certainly my sympathies were with the young people. And the older people were saying in the theater, actors do not complain or say anything about the script. They are hired to do the job. That's up to the producer and the director. The director was a schmuck, and I don't know who he was at the time. But he was all torn by all this discussion. And I never forget one old man by the name of Wayne Airy, I think his name was. Boy, the way these names are coming back. For a guy like myself, it was a terrible memory. Wayne got up, and I said, oh, God, we're going to lose the fight, because he was very distinguished. Gray, white hair, ruddy skin, the kind of actor with a voice like God. You'd cast him as God immediately. I mean, you wouldn't think of any other role. And he got up, and the women, the older women on the project, the older character women, I know all adored Wayne because he was so romantic. And he got up and he said, I, too, in all my life in the theater, 40 years in the theater, have ever heard actors criticizing, raising their voice, and challenging the director and the writer and the producer. And I think it's time that they did, and I think it is wonderful that they're doing that. And I would vote to eliminate that word from our script, and I think it is well, he swung everybody. Swung all the old ladies, and Wayne does it.
Oh, yeah.
So we won that fight, and that was my first remembrance of a political fight. And after that, my whole life, I think my life was so changed. Once I got to the Federal Theater, and then once I met Frank Silvera in Boston, once I knew Negro actors, once I got involved in that, so then I, later on in my life, when I did Native Son with Canada Lee and toured with a black company, and saw injustice as from the racial point of view, from an ethnic minority point of view, and saw the hate in people's eyes, white people. It got me involved in the black theater movement. I taught in Harlem later on when I became a Broadway actor and worked in hits. I would go back to Harlem and teach at the American Negro Theater, Committee for the Negro in the Arts, a Harlem workshop, wherever. But if they failed, that was all right. I worked with Frank, and that was something that I feel dedicated to this day.
What did Frank Silvera, could you talk about him a little bit? What really did he do for you?
Well, Frank never thought of himself as a Negro because he was from the West Indies, and his brother John Silvera had passed for 30 years, and the whole family was distinguished, hardworking. The blacks were used by the British in the West Indies as the overseers, as the constabulary, so that he always associated blacks with the other side, the poor who were made in the constabulary, and so there was a real racial difference. It was divided, divide and conquer technique. And it was when he was protesting as a slave that he would never be a slave. It was because he didn't consider himself a Negro, but he was on the Negro Project in Boston. And when I got to know him, and we became very close friends, and he took me in, we used to have long discussions. I talked to him about Robeson, about Dr. Du Bois. He got to read all that material, the poetry of the black writers, Langston Hughes. Because once he recognized that he was black in America, it wouldn't make any difference. They considered him black, whether he considered it or not. And then he became one of the great fighters on the whole racial question. But I take a lot of credit for introducing him to that area. He also introduced me, though, to many black intellectuals who stayed at his house, who were going to Harvard at the time, who were going to some of the colleges. It was like a club. I mean, nobody understands that world. I only understood it because I was admitted to that world. I was the only white guy in there. And because I was living with Frank. And so a reverend, a guy studying for the clergy, a black guy, we would flop in there and have balls and talk till 5 in the morning, and it was famous actors came in who were black, and if the discussion was always on their songs were being sung from West Indies, and I learned a whole culture that I didn't know about. And there was a whole in thing that unless you were part of that world, you would not know it existed. Because now we see much more of it coming out in the open.
Was Ralph Coleman involved in that too, or was he just...
Yeah, well, no, Ralph Coleman was a kind of director and a little more stiff-necked and serious and quite different. We were I'm sure Ralph was much older than us.
Yes.
Frank and I were about the same age, and I think we hit it off that way, but I remember some of the people. I don't remember whether Ted Ward was on the project. Theodore Ward, the playwright. I think he was up there for a while, and I got to know him there. But we were interested in forming a group. When I was we formed a dramatic group called the Transit Theater, Frank and I. So that after the Federal Theater failed in Boston, Frank and I formed this group called the Transit Theater. We did Plant the Sun. We did a play called Transit, with one-act play. That was integrated. Then we were working on a black version, the Negro version of Lower Debts by Gorky, which Frank thought would be an important play. And we did Cradle of Rock. Now, when we did Cradle, I was at that time a radio announcer at WHDH, and I also was an organizer for the textile workers. So at night while I was working radio announcer, I would go to Lawrence and help organize the textile workers. And then in between that time, I had to work in this dramatic group to organize the group, and got them tied in with the ILGW in Boston, so we could do shows for the working people. And Frank was my right hand, and then he did Cradle of Rock. I was fired from Boston. I said "My God" on the air. I was
on the radio.
Just a matter of fact, my mother had 2 cards, which I still have in my collection. I can't save it. I was became the head of the announcers in Boston at WHDH, the voice from home to the fishermen at sea. And I had 8 announcers working for me, and I was raised from $25 a week to $30 a week. And I wrote a card to my mother saying, I've just now been promoted to be chief of announcers, and they gave me a $5 raise, and I'm getting $30 a week now. And she has another card that afternoon that said, "Dear Mom, I'm coming home. I just got fired." I did a program called Depot Dialogues at the North Station in Boston, and what we would do is I would go down as a radio announcer, and the engineer with me, and then people seeing you set up would start gathering at the depot, and then you would ask them questions about Noonan's Hair Patrol, and the kind of questions were really on a very high level, like where do you put the fork, on the left-hand side of the plate or the right-hand side? And if you get the right answer, you got $2 silver. If you got the wrong answer, we gave you a bottle of Noonan's Hair Patrol, which is one of the reasons I've lost my hair. I did the worst hair patrol in history, and probably still is being sold in Boston. And but that was, I said "My God" to a lady when I asked her a question about whether you put a fork on the left-hand side or the right-hand side of the plate, and she said, "I don't know." And I said, "My God, you've never heard of Emily Post?" And the moment I said "God," I was cut off the air. Protests came into the station, the use of God in the name of God in vain, and that was the end of my career. So they fired me that day. I was made a chief of staff. I went back to New York because I'd already had Boston and everything else like that. And later on, Frank and I retained our friendship. I loaned him money to go out to Hollywood, and he became a very distinguished actor. He just ended up in a very unfortunate way. He had taught me, he who had taught me that when you fix up an electrical fixture in a house, you disengage you pull the fuse. You don't do anything electrical with the wires attached, and he did it in Boston. We had no money, so we used to have light. We never paid an electric bill. He tied off the landlord's line on the hall to our lighting system, so that we used the landlord's electricity. I mean, things like that, you know. So we never had any problems as far as lights were concerned. But he came home to his apartment in California, tired, driving all night, had done a television show, and his what do you call it? The garbage disposal unit was not working properly. It overflowed, and he wasn't wearing shoes. He started to fix it, and he was standing in water, and he electrocuted himself fixing that goddamn unit. And I guess I spoke at his funeral services in New York, and I flew out here the same day, and that night there were funeral services at the inner city. Bea Richards, who was a great friend of Frank's, had services for Frank, kind of a happening. But he was my dearest friend, and when I say that, the only one, I would say, that my dearest friend, and a tremendously talented director and actor, who got me to teach acting up at the American Negro Theater, whom I got to work at the Harlem Workshop when, in other words, we helped each other, continually dedicated to getting the black experience and integration and fighting for it and still fighting for it.
Could you talk a little bit about, you mentioned earlier about Revolt of the Beavers and the problems it caused. Could you talk about that play? Was it really as controversial as they made it?
Well, now I look back at it was pretty radical. It was. I mean, we had this bad beaver, right, who played by Ben Ross, and he was everybody had to work stripping the barks, and they were real slaves. And then the good beavers, I think Julie Dassin was a good beaver, a leader of the beavers, played Oakleaf, and he led, and we were hoods Rough, tough, and gruff. I'm sure we represented the worst elements, the Pinkerton
Did you do a gangster?
strike breakers. We did a marvelous dance, and I enjoyed the whole experience. I'd never sung before in my life. And matter of fact, I would say that was the first singing experience. Later on, when I was in 5 musicals, I forgot that I'd ever done any singing on the Federal Theater.
Mm-hmm.
But it was, I think it got to be revolutionary because we had this revolt of the good beavers and the bad beavers, and we won.
So
hopefully won, but it was.
You could say it was kind of the good guys versus the bad guys.
Yeah, that's all. It was not a really revolutionary thing, but anything in those days that said more than. I mean, look, the term revolt of the beavers. Mm-hmm. The terminology was the one that must have gotten the Boy Scouts of America. I don't particularly think it was that dangerous. It was really marvelous. The kids loved it because
Did they really?
We had marvelous reactions from the kids because they would cheer the good guys and they would boo the bad guy. But Ben, for example, had a marvelous throne as the king of the beavers. I remember him. It was a barber chair with a lot of levers. You know how kids, when you sit in a barber chair, you can move the levers and go up and down and you can swing around? He had one of those.
Oh, my God.
So they loved seeing so he may have been a bad guy, but he had
the chair.
He had the chair, and then the chair was connected with a slide so that when he wanted to go down and talk to anybody, just press a lever and the front of his chair went down, he slid right down. So it was so imaginative, so different from any children's theater at that time. Still to this day would be considered an extraordinary work that Oscar Saul and Lou Lance had done. That was inventive and beautifully directed and beautifully acted by very good actors. You remember you showed me a picture, Charlie Willard, is that his name? Now there was an example of an old vaudevillian, like W.C. Fields. He was an old vaudevillian. He had on the project, he was poor because there was no work for vaudevillians anymore. It was a depression. And here was a guy that I swear to God never read Stanislavski, never had done anything but vaudeville, and he played the wind, and he used every device that a good actor would use. He fell right in it when he was the wind, and when he blew, and when he came, and he was a real wind. He could be a mean wind, and he could be a good warm wind, and he was different kind of winds. And so imaginative that now that I think back of this, I never really appreciated any of that. I knew that he was good. And I knew that it was all an adventure for me. But for all of these people, they were having a chance to use their talent. And I think that, you see, if the project lasted longer, we were getting to know each other.
Yeah.
We're getting to know who was good and who was not. That regrouping people, you began to feel that if it had lasted much longer, there would have been no length to which we were gone to develop an extraordinary theater throughout America. Not just in New York City. It was not just New York. It was all over. I would then have loved to have gone to Seattle and gone to Dallas and, as an actor. I didn't care about money. It just cared about being alive and to share these experiences so that there's a period of enormous health in America in the creative field. I mean, I can't even, my association with the Artist Project, when we demonstrated against the cuts, and you met Sawyer, and you met all of the famous artists who today are extraordinary artists and very famous. You met writers who were famous. You were involved with dancers like Anna Sokolow. And I mean, I knew all of the dancers. I studied dancing while I was on the Federal Theater. In other words, I was able to take dance classes with Felicia Sorrell so I could study ballet, tap, and ballet and jazz. You could study while you were on the project because you had 4 hours in the daytime, and then you could do all the other things that you did. There were other parts of the WPA that were available to you as an adult education program. So that I studied every phase of the theater while I was at the project. And that was what was interesting. You met all of these people in revolutionary ferment who were challenging, doing dances, for example, were extraordinary. Helen Tamiris and the others, that Jane Dudley and all of the dancers that, and Anna Sokolau, who had exciting ideas of dance, and dance